So, hello everyone again. This will be the concluding session of our workshop, and it's a special session that I'll say a few words about in a minute, but let me also add that this session will go until 5:30, and after that there was a proposal that I think is a good one, that we stay a little bit longer just to wrap up things a bit and maybe try and say what questions have been left open, what questions would justify gathering together next year in Jerusalem or somewhere. Okay, so now for this session, it's a special privilege and pleasure to have this discussion, which is initiated by the foundation of a new museum on campus. It's the Steinhardt Museum of Natural History and National Research Center. Is that how you see it? Okay, then let's stick with the Natural History Museum. We were talking about this, about the idea of over dinner, about the idea of founding a natural history museum today, where the Natural History Museum has a history of its own. And I think it's an especially interesting topic to discuss in the context of loss and preservation, in the context of the workshop. And so the idea was to ask Professor Tamar Dayan, who actually is the spirit as well as the engine, we can say, behind this project, as well as our discussants, which I'll present later on. So Tamar will present the idea of the museum, then there will be three discussants who I will present in turn, and then we will open it up a bit for open discussion. So Tamar, thank you for being here with us. The floor is yours.
Okay. So, thanks very much, Shai, for the invitation and for the initiative. And I had a really interesting last 2 days for the hours that I could be here, so I really enjoyed it, and thanks to all organizers. And I will talk about natural history museums in general and a little bit about ours, because that's the reason to start out, and anyway, because it's hard to stop me from talking about it anyway. So it's and the story in Israel is that there's no National Museum of Natural History and no natural history museums in general, which is an oddity at an international scale. I mean, I think the Middle East is the only part of the world where there is no natural history museums in general. And there was a science policy decision dating almost 30 years ago not to build a National Museum of Natural History as a separate standalone research institution like the Smithsonian, from where Dr. David Firth comes, but to recognize the university museums as national university collections as national collections, a National Museum of Natural History in the making, which is the Scandinavian model. And in fact, what we're doing now is somewhat belatedly working on this recommendation, science policy recommendation, dating to the mid-'80s. So we work under the auspices of the Israel Academy. We get special government support. We have a strong communication and support, as you can see, from various government agencies that rely on the museum for the various activities, in particular environmental protection and agriculture. And in general, the project is like many other such museums. It's a consortium, because usually university museums started in different departments. So it's the same is true for here. So we have the Zoological Museum and the Herbarium and the Physical Anthropology collections and the Biological Archaeology collections. And together they joined forces to establish the Steinhardt Museum of Natural History, which is Israel's National Center for Biodiversity Studies. Yay, we've mastered it. It's been a many years until we reached that. You have to realize that the whole culture of museums and university does not exist in Israel. It's very, very rare. And so it was very unusual for an Israeli university to actually reach a decision to have a museum in a university. And as we know, there's hundreds of natural history museums in American and European universities, but it's the first time avant-garde in Israel. We're very excited about it. The project is actually is already established. What we're waiting is for our shell, our home. But the museum is almost fully functional except for exhibitions. So to give you a little bit of an idea of where we're at, these are activity statistics for the past 8 years. Perhaps Yael, Dr. Yael Gavrieli, who runs our public program, may say something about the latter to the visitors and the website entries. But before that, you can see that it's an active project. We're productive at an international scale. And we anticipate that the trajectory of growth will continue, and we'll talk about this in a minute. And this really reflects what happens with natural history museums world round. And the reason is that natural history museums are archives of nature. And it's really liberating to say archives here, because if I say that in the Faculty of Life Sciences, it sounds dusty, moldy, and obsolete. But archives, okay, so that's so that's what we really are. And the collections are the main testable long-term record of biodiversity and the environment. And considering the fact that doubtless the greatest challenge facing humankind in the 21st century is the environmental challenge, including the biodiversity challenge, the challenge to maintain functioning ecosystems, natural history museums in the world are now flourishing. I should add, I've been asked during the break, so I will say a word. As you know, at the point where the double helix of the DNA was discovered, there was a feeling in biology that everything that's really important will be discovered from the subcellular level. And this was really the ruling paradigm in biology worldwide for about 30 years, which in retrospect is really surprising because there's elementary particle physics, but nobody thought that chemistry was obsolete or geology was obsolete or hydrology or atmospheric studies. So it's a sort of an oddity for biological sciences to imagine that you can do reductionist science at this level and draw from the subcellular mechanism into levels of ecosystem function or community ecology or any type of higher level of organization. So for about 30 years, museums, natural history museums, have not fared well. They were considered classic, which is, as you know, more or less death sentence in terms of academia. And this has changed in the Western world at early 90s, I think, late 80s, and Israel is somewhat provincial, so it's taking a little longer to reach. But the understanding that this is a crucial infrastructure for biodiversity research has made a huge change in the perceptions of natural history museums, and we're heralding this era also in Israel and very excited about it. One of the crucial things about natural history museums, ours and in general, is that we don't lose, we're talking about loss, the scientific ability to read and decipher this archive. And that's a really challenging issue. Globally, not only in Israel. Yossi Leshem said that I complain that birds aren't all of biodiversity, and he's not here, so I can restate, birds are not all of biodiversity. In fact, they're a tiny fragment. They're about 10,000 species out of, we don't know, anywhere between 5 and 30 million species that have not yet been identified. Under 2 million species have so far been identified. Most of biodiversity is invertebrates, arthropods, soil fungi, nematodes, unicellular organisms, etc., etc. And they're all part of functioning ecosystems. They're all important, whether they're a 2-inch fish or they're a fungus. And the approach says now to maintain ecosystem function and ecosystem integrity, which means that we need to know a lot about these species. So if we were talking about biases in red listing species, the first bias stems from the fact that we know mammals pretty well, we know birds pretty well, we don't know the majority of arthropods or the majority of other invertebrates. Even those that we do know, we know from little bits of genitalia or so on that let expert taxonomists identify one species from another, but we know very little about their biology and certainly very, very little bit about their conservation status. I was saying in the break that, in fact, in Israel, there was a little revolution about 5 years ago where the first invertebrates actually came into the list of species protected by law. Before that, no invertebrates were in the list. And now there's a number of butterflies who are. There's a big battle because the Ministry of Agriculture envisioned that it's something that will stop its use of pesticides. hopefully that will work, that at least in some places. So this is even new to list invertebrates as endangered in Israel.
What year was that?
It was the end of Gidon Ezra's term, so you need to calculate back. I don't remember. It was about maybe 5 years, 6 years, something in that ballpark. Really a new thing. There was a guy called Guy Pe'el who lobbied aggressively. As these things happen, you have an aggressive lobbyer, and he managed to persuade Gidon Ezra, and it was a battle. No question about it. So we know that we need to be able to identify species to even talk about their conservation status, let alone talk about other things. If you look at the number of citations of papers using natural history museum or museums, you can see a very sharp trend of increase. The same is for natural history museum or museums and conservation, which means there's a big community now who's really interested in the potential of natural history museums to address their science, and that's mostly conservation science. It's a revolution in terms of natural history museums, and there's also a lot of publications, I put only a few here, that refer to the ethics of natural history museums, the type of data they have, how we can actually draw data from it, the resolutions, the new methodologies that need to be implemented, and so on. The favorite title that I have is The Climate Change and the Biosphere Response, Unlocking the Collections Vault, which I thought was very nice. And one of the things that we need to remember is to unlock this collections vault, we need to know taxonomy. We need to be able to identify the species. It's a big challenge now globally, considering most of the species have yet to be identified. But even the species that have been identified require expert taxonomic knowledge for their study. And this is something that natural history museums worldwide lead. So there are studies on I just put a few talking about this crisis and sort of analyzing it quantitatively. It's part and parcel the Global Taxonomy Initiative of the Convention on Biological Diversity, saying effective conservation and management of biodiversity depends in large part on our understanding of taxonomy, unfortunately, etc., etc. As you can imagine, the unfortunately. So Israel is signatory also to a convention that requires it to promote this type of research. And in fact, this is really crucial research for a lot of things, because we know now that we've evolved in the biosphere with a lot of other species, and we need to be able to manage them, to use them sustainably, and to protect them. And whether they're crop pests or house pests or pollinators or biological control agents or invasive species, bird strikes, indicators, etc., disease vectors, you need to know these species. And you can only stop and say, what were we thinking in academia or in research circles when we were letting this field go to ruin, where you can't do the most basic things without having this knowledge. And now that we're finally beginning to mainstream biodiversity into a lot of activities, we hope that the significance of this science is more evident. And in our museum, we established the Israel Taxonomy Initiative, which is a joint venture with the entire higher education system, research system, and several government ministries and agencies that require this knowledge. Okay, so what natural history collections allow us to do is to ask new questions as disciplines evolve and develop and new tools are invented. And this is just one example from our museum. This is a cheetah. For those of you who are not aware of it, we used to have cheetahs. The last sighting is in the middle of the 20th century in the Negev Desert. But the only hard evidence of cheetahs between East Africa and East Asia is this specimen housed in our collections, collected at the turn of the 20th century in Wadi Arava. And what we do now, and we've been getting requests from all over the world, is to cut little pieces of its pelt and sequence it and see the relatedness of cheetahs. There's a lot of talk about cheetah conservation. Are they part of the Asian population or part of the African population? You'd be pleased to know they're part of the Asian population. Not that we're reintroducing them or anything, but it was good to know anyway. And that's the kind of question that we can now answer with tools that we were not able to deal with in the past. And probably were not that interested, because the German priest who shot this cheetah at the turn of the 20th century was just interested in putting a cheetah in his collection, which was very fortunate for us. Natural history museums have various unique characteristics. First, they're the work of generations, which is very unusual in the natural sciences now, when you have something that's really the work of generations to rely on. And sometimes really heartwarming. You see these people in the 90s pottering around, and stuff they collected 60, 70 years ago is super relevant today, which is really very cheerful. And maybe there's hope for us too at the end. Then the time scales are variable, and they begin as life begins about 3 billion years ago and continue to stuff that we've received this morning. It depends, of course, on the museum, on the focus of the research and focus of collecting and so on. But really, they allow us to study things at different time scales, and you'll hear a little bit about these time scales from some of these discussants. The taxonomic breadth is huge, as opposed to conservation organizations or NGOs that mostly focus on birds or species that are easily identified in the field. Here, there's expert taxonomists, and there's a wide range of taxa being studied. There's high taxonomic reliability, both because of the expertise, but also because we have the voucher specimens, and those are the key. Collections have specimens. In our case, 5 million specimens. In the United States National Museum, 150 million specimens, give or take. So, but those are the basis for everything. So even if we don't trust the identifications, or we know identifications change, we can go back to the actual specimens and verify it, and so that's hard evidence. So I'll give you just a few examples of stuff that happens in collections from our collections. All species distributions, except for elephants, rhinos, and maybe giraffes and baobab trees, are based on checklists that are based on natural history collections. And you need to know what the species is, you need to see its distribution, and then you can analyze the distribution, look at global species richness, restricted range species, threatened species, and so on. But the basis is what we find in natural history museums. And then what's happening in a lot of museums today is looking at the effects of global change on distributions, in particular climate change, and how it's affected distributions of species over the past century. And from this, modeling and analyzing the expected trajectory of species. In this case, we can say Israeli mammals are expected to shift to the west and northwest as climate change will continue, which is really important for adaptation to climate change, when we need to know which open spaces we need to preserve. Invasive species move around. This is a slide by Bela Galil, Professor Bela Galil. 680 exotic species found in the Mediterranean today, and they're identified and can be traced and tracked through natural history museums. Adaptation to climate change is a big thing, and over the 20th century, people have been started studying microevolutionary change in response to climate change and its rate to make inferences about what type of adaptation can we expect to occur over the 20th century. We can look at environmental change from other directions. For example, this is a study on dugongs, on sea cows, that we participated in, looking at stable isotopes and analyzing the environment based on stable isotopes. And the nice thing is all these things were of course, there was no stable isotope analysis when our dugongs, our sea cows, were collected, but the material is there, and we can return again and again and ask questions. Invasive species are a huge thing worldwide now, and museum collections figure heavily in their study, in their tracing, and in identifications for the agricultural services, the plant protection services, of which we provide hundreds every year. And here's the invasive species of the Mediterranean, again based on natural history collections, again Professor Bela Galil. Pollutants, heavy metals, other pollutants are incorporated in organic material, can be studied later, and then the trajectory of pollution can be studied over decades or even centuries, or the effect of past pollution on the morphology of specimens that we see on the museum. And again, these are texts that have been studied in our museum. We can draw now, and with next generation sequencing even better, genes to analyze population genetics, genetic bottlenecks and what they say about conservation, analyze population size and structure, all based on genetic material. Study parasites, because every fish and mollusk and other texts, these are specifically the ones that we've been studying, comes with the parasites. Some of them are really important for humans, not only for the animals. Spread of disease in ancient human populations. I don't know, Hila, if you'll talk about it or not. This was supposed to be promotional for Israel Hershkovitz, so in our museum, the physical anthropologists have been studying disease in the subfossil remains that they have. In many museums now, wildlife disease is studied through study of natural history collections. So we're in the process of development. It's going to be 2 minutes, so I'm fine. We're in the process of developing and carving our niche like other natural history museums in the world now that are pretty much looking for their mission, or many of them are redefining their missions, retesting their missions, especially in view of the conservation challenge. So there's basic research that belongs to 3 faculties, 6 departments, with the cultures of 3 faculties and 6 departments, which is interesting and will probably be more and more interesting as we evolve. We have public programs, Yael will talk a little bit about that, which are at the beginning until we have proper galleries. And there's a whole area here, what we called applied biodiversity science, as biodiversity is being mainstreamed in all governments, agencies and international agencies. Natural history museums are redefining their role in putting support for monitoring, surveying, stopping invasive species, producing data for the public, producing data for decision makers, etc. And we are pretty much working on where we are in this scene in Israel. All of a sudden there's a huge avalanche of organizations, the Ministry of Defense, Environmental Protection and Agriculture, Israel Nature Parks Authority, and so on, who all need our knowledge, and we're trying not to drown under the demand and see how we manage to do all that, and in a university where the culture is scientific excellence and nothing else. So it's definitely a challenge. I went to the University of Copenhagen, rated number 40 in the world, a rating that Tel Aviv University can only dream about. And they have a wonderful National Museum of Natural History in Copenhagen. If they can do it, we can do it. It'll just take somewhat of an effort. So I was looking for something to say in sum, but I haven't been sleeping in the last few nights, so I decided to cite someone else rather than think of something very clever to write. And this is the priority areas and sciences of the United States National Science Foundation 2015. And the summary in 2 slides. Biological research collections represent the documented scientific history of life on Earth across the globe. Scientists, government agencies, industry, citizens use collections to document and understand, study global change, formulate, advance, improve interactions, educate general public, devise new practical applications, etc., etc., etc. But what they continue is, despite all this progress, natural history collections remain underutilized for answering contemporary questions about fundamental aspects of biological processes, and their proposal is for, thus collections are poised to become a critical resource for developing transformative approaches to address key questions in biology and potentially develop applications that extend biology to physical, mathematical, engineering, and the social sciences. So with this challenge in view, I will conclude. Thank you.
This is great. So we have now three panelists, and what we've asked, which I'll introduce in a minute, but what we've asked the panelists is to briefly get us into some discussion, present themselves in the context of the discussion, and then what we hope to do is really open for a discussion in which we will all take part. So our three discussants are Dr. Yael Gavrieli. She's the director of Nature Campus, the Meyer Siegel's Garden for Zoological Research, and Botanic Gardens, and part of the Steinhardt Museum of Natural History. Everything okay? Then Dr. Dafna Langgut, Sonia and Marco Nadler Institute of Archaeology, part of that, and the Steinhardt Museum of Natural History. And Dr. Hila Mai, she's a new faculty member at the Department of Anatomy at the Faculty of Medicine, and also a curator of physical anthropology at the museum. So I guess you'd like to sit three of you here, or you'd like each in their turn? Whatever works for you.
You asked some presentations, so we got Shai's email and I asked him what to do, and she said, okay, just have some comments. So I'll have some comments about preservation in natural history museums. And when I thought of...
Turn off your telephone. The battery will go off.
And when I wish to make reference to in our natural history museum, when I'm thinking about contemporary natural history museum, I wish to make two references. One, what it was in history, and the other one to cultural museums, art museums, and from this to look at preservation in contemporary natural history museums. So when we look at the history of natural history collections, we see that there is a changing paradigm, really, because if you look at Hans Sloane, which is the founder of Natural History Collection and had a Cabinet of Curiosities, later became the foundation of the British Museum, which even 150 years later branched to the Natural History Museum in London. So his catalogue included a list of oddities, a salamander's egg from the East Indies, a rat which was starved to death, 4 paws of an orangutan, and etc., etc. Nothing common, all peculiar, strange things that he collected, and of course became Cabinet of Curiosities, which I'm sure you talked about. Now, if I look at our catalogue of collection, and I just took a random Excel sheet that I had in my in honor of Tamar, and well, it starts with an A, and you see the list. It doesn't matter which animal it is; it's really some kind of mice, don't they? But you see that we have a list of them, several, nothing peculiar, nothing even rare. It's all common species, and we have many of them. And it's really a changing of collecting the unique into collecting the common, because what we see now in natural history museums is that we build an archive, a database of what we have, and what we have usually is the common thing, not the rare thing. And then when you look at museums in general, and I try to categorize them into two general categories. Don't don't start to criticize me. It's a generalization between cultural museums and research museums, in which research museum is any museum. It can be scientific. I mean, it can be natural history. It can be archaeology. It can be history, or cultural museums. So all of them are collecting objects. But the motive for collection is very, very different, because while cultural museums collect the objects in order to preserve the culture, research museums collect and preserve the objects in order to research. And that is the motive changed the outcome. Later on, all of them, I mean, all museums do exhibitions, education. I must emphasize that research museums, at least natural history museums, do conservation ex situ I mean, there are infrastructure for conservation, of nature conservation, but that's another aspect. I won't discuss it. But the outcome then is different. Since the motive is different, the outcome is different. Now, when we look at cultural museums, they preserve culture as usually they preserve, but they do it in order to generate discourse about the culture. And sometimes it's doing controversial things. I mean, it's like this sculpture exhibit from piece of art from the sculpture garden of MoMA in New York, which is, as you can see, very controversial, or some people can look at it as controversial. And it's, they don't try, I mean, sometimes the collection and they preserve the culture, it's the Mona Lisa, but many times it's in order to be, to create a discussion. In comparison to that, research museums do the opposite. Because in research museum, we generate knowledge, as Tamar described in detail, and Hila and Dafna, I'm sure will talk about it also. So we generate knowledge, but we do it in order to preserve a paradigm. But the preservation that we do is preservation of paradigm, either it's scientific paradigm or conservation, or nature conservation paradigm. And it's very different. Even if you see that that Natural History Museum take on to put some controversial issue, like climate change or evolution, they will always exhibit the consensus. They won't exhibit. I mean, you won't see in a respectable natural history museum. You won't see an exhibition about creationism. There will be many exhibitions about evolution, but none about creationism. And if there will be an exhibition about creationism, it will get so much criticism from its colleagues that it will ban it. So, so you have here kind of a mirror outcome in both cultural museum and research museum. And after I wrote this slide, I said, well, let's check it. And I went to the websites of the MoMA and the American Museum of Natural History. And sure enough, it was there. The mission of the MoMA is the Museum of Modern Art seeks to create a dialogue between the established and the experimental, the past and the present, in an environment that is responsive to the issue of modern contemporary art, while being accessible, etc., etc. And the American Museum says exactly the opposite. It wants really to instill the scientific paradigm to the public. It wants to discover, interpret, and disseminate through scientific research and education knowledge, consensual knowledge, about human culture, natural world, and the universe. No controversy here. So that was one thought. And sometimes preservation meets science and art merge. And that's a huge project that was at the American Museum of Natural History of preserving the dioramas of the, it was a huge project of renovation of the North American mammals diorama. I must point that when they were built, those dioramas, they were a breakthrough in a scientific approach in ecology, because it was not the first time, but it was part of a new frontier in museology, where animals were shown in their habitat and not as soldiers in exhibition cabinets. And that was really revolutionary. And now the American Museum decided to renovate it as cultural heritage and to preserve these, those dioramas, which are looked upon as really as pieces of art now. So,
okay, thank you so much.
So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for inviting me. Today I would like to emphasize how my work, my research is linked to the museum and to general questions that might interest you as well. So I direct the Laboratory of Archaeobotany and Ancient Environments at the Institute of Archaeology here at Tel Aviv University. And in addition, I'm also a curator of several collections at the Steinhardt Museum. These are the collections: pollen reference collection, wood collection, charcoal collection, and archaeobotanical collection. That means wooden implements, for example, that we find in during archaeological excavations. So today I will focus only on the pollen collection and will try to show how it relates to the questions you raised during the last 2 days. So first of all, what are pollen grains? So pollen are the male sex cells that are needed for the plant reproduction. And in the pollination process, pollen grains need to be transferred from the anther of the flower to the stigma of the flower, the same flower, but usually another flower from the same species. And we have agents that help for the pollination process, such as insects, winds, and water, of course. And each plant species produces its own unique pollen form. It's only micron in size, but can tell us fascinating information about different issues. The pollen grains has a very durable outer layer, and therefore the grains can be preserved for hundreds of thousands of years in the sediments. So our study is not only based on recent pollen grains, but also on a fossil record. So within the recent pollen assemblages, we address questions such as biodiversity, allergies, which are caused by pollen grains. We cooperate with the medical department at Tel Aviv University, forensic investigations, and Palynology, meaning from where the bees were collected their honey from which flowers. Within the fossil pollen assemblages, the questions that we usually raise are connected to the evolution of plants, vegetation history, and based on changes in vegetation, we can conclude on changes in climate, human impact on natural environment, meaning we can trace evidence for the beginning of agriculture, for tree clearing, for grazing activities, and so on. And of course, we extract pollen from archaeological sites in order to answer questions such as ancient diet, fooders, seasonality of site occupation, and so on. And now I would like to give 2 short examples about the use of the fossil pollen record in our studies. So this is the site of Ramat Rachel. It is located near Jerusalem. And here the archaeologists from Tel Aviv University discovered a palace dated to the 7th up till the 4th centuries BC. And during the 5th and 4th century BC, this palace was occupied by the Persian ruler. The entire region was under the hegemony of the Persian Empire, and the Persian ruler, the representative of the empire, sat in Ramat Rachel. And adjacent to his palace, there was a garden, a royal garden. It is very unique in archaeology to discover a garden. Here you can see the soil, the garden soil, which was brought from elsewhere. It's not a local soil. And in addition, the archaeologists discovered different structures, such as pools and tunnels, which were part of the garden facilities and were covered with different layers of plaster. of course, the archaeologists were very curious to know what grew with this unique royal garden. And unfortunately, botanical remains have not been preserved in the garden soil. And then I came up with the idea that maybe if the plaster on the different structures within the garden were ever renewed when the garden was in its blooming, then the pollen grains which traveled in the air could have been trapped within the wet plaster. So with these very low chances, I took some samples of plaster back to the lab, and by a chemical process, I extracted the pollen grains. And the results showed that in addition to the local flora, the natural components such as pines and oaks, which are typical to the Judean hills, I also identify pollen grains of fruit trees and ornamental plants, such as grapevines, myrtle, poplar, willow, figs, water lilies, and in addition, I also identify trees which are not common to the native flora and were brought from far-off lands, such as the Persian walnut, which usually grow in Anatolia, in the Kafkaz Mountains, the Iranian Plateau, the cedar of Lebanon, which is known from antiquity as prestige tree, birch, and the most surprising find, which marks its earliest appearance in ancient Israel, is the citron, etrog. This is the first citrus tree which arrived to the Mediterranean. It's originated in Southeast Asia, and by the Persian Empire it was brought to Persia and then to Ramat Rachel. And from Ramat Rachel it spread all over the Mediterranean. And the citron, as you all probably know, later acquired a symbolic role in Judaism as one of the 4 species we used in the Feast of Tabernacles, Chag Sukkot. And in the Bible, the citron is not mentioned. It is only written in Leviticus, the fruit of the goodly tree, meaning Pri Etz Hadar. And the correlation between Pri Etz Hadar to citron was made only several centuries later. And now I will move to the other example. This is based on a core which was extracted from the inner part of Lake Kinneret. And here we wanted to reconstruct past vegetation and climate conditions. We extracted pollen grains from the sediments, and we identify the past vegetation. And based on changes in vegetation, we were able to identify dry periods during the historical periods, the biblical periods, the Bronze and Iron Ages in Israel. So here we see very low percentages of arboreal pollen, meaning that at that time we had less precipitation in our region. We have consecutive years of droughts. And this is dated to about 3,200 years before present. This period is now known as the end of the late Bronze. A collapse occurred in the entire Eastern Mediterranean at that time. The empires collapsed, all the complex societies which flourished before that vanished, and there were several options which archaeologists suggested for this crisis, like natural catastrophic such as storms, of earthquakes, volcanic activities, plagues, innovations, and also the climate change was on the table, but there was no reliable paleoclimate record to support this idea. So the Sea of Galilee pollen record corroborates the assumption that the climate change, the dry conditions that prevalent at the end of the late Bronze initiate the process, the domino effect of the collapse of the entire empires, just one after another, because of less precipitation, which caused less grazing opportunities and failure of crops, and that, of course, caused the rise in food prices and initiate the entire collapse process in the region. It caused in archaeology the crisis years. So to sum up, based on these two examples, we can see that vegetation history of the region, we can learn about the vegetation history of the region, we can trace evidence for the introduction of fruit trees and their origin and their role in our tradition. We can learn about human influence on past vegetation, the beginning of domestication, the tree clearing, overgrazing. All these phenomena can be traced within the archaeobotanical records. Climate changes and their possible links to ancient settlers in the region, as I just presented. And in general, we can say that studies which are botanical collection based are increasing our knowledge in diverse research fields and also in the time dimension. The reconstruction of the ancient vegetation reflects the baseline condition before the major impact of human on natural environment. And I think this is very important because with my study, it is possible to know what were the components, the exact components of the natural environment before human influence, human interruption, human impact on the natural environment. We can go back to 100,000 years and more, and even more with this type of research. And last, the cooperation and collaboration. The items of the reference collections are available upon request. Scientists can come to the museum or borrow samples for their research. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I don't have a presentation.
Good, so we can see you.
Hello, I'm Hila. I'm from the Dan David Center for Human Evolution and Biohistory Research at the Steinhardt Museum. And actually, I'm here in a short notice. I replaced Professor Israel Hershkovitz, who was supposed to come and couldn't at the last moment. And I want to just give you a glimpse into our anthropological collection in the Steinhardt Museum. This anthropological collection that are housed in Tel Aviv University are one of the largest and most important anthropological collections in the world. We have specimens from 2,000 years ago till recent times, and the greatest advantage of these samples are that they are all excavated in Israel. That for our case, in our case, it's good that it's a small place. It means that all these individuals that can be from the same period of time or different periods of time were relatively exposed to similar conditions. And the greatest thing of studying bones is that is the first evidence of people's life before, of what individuals did, which health problems they had, their nutrition. We can learn from the bones and the skeletal remains many things about past populations' behavior. And it's not only about biological things, it's also about cultural practices. From the way they are buried, we can understand the complexity of the society when he started. And from studying, for example, situations or transition like the agricultural revolution that occurred like 15,000 years ago and changed the life considerably from what people used to do for thousands of years of hunting and gathering They became farmers and were sitting in the same village, and this changed their health and their social organization considerably. So by studying these bones, we can understand what our ancestors were doing before. But it's not so simple. When the bone that we get to the anthropological collections are from various archaeological sites. And the preservation of these bones differ considerably from the ground that they came from. They can come from the desert, where they're buried in limestone. They can come from karstic caves. They can come from under the sea. And think about that they were buried there for thousands of years until some archaeological and anthropological came and took them out. And then they changed the condition. And from this moment, we don't know how fast the deterioration occurs. Now, when the bones are excavated, usually, unfortunately, they're in a bad condition. And therefore, we need pretty fast to treat them with material that, most of them, there are glues that are dissolved in acetone, and we, first of all, we just put this material on the bones. We wait until they are hardened, and then we can start to do the puzzle of reconstructing the shape. They remain that we found that, and again we use glue to put these pieces together. And the problem with glue is that we don't know how much damage it makes to the material and that is hidden inside the bone. And what I mean by that, Tamar mentioned before the DNA that was extracted from the bone to try to trace evidence for TB in bones, in skeletal remains from Atlit Yam. And the problem, once you put acetone and glue into the bone, I don't know what happens to the DNA, for example, that are in the bone, that from the beginning it's not in a very good condition because the DNA is destroyed very, very fast. So we have a problem of the DNA. We have a problem in damaging the collagen that is in the bone and can help in dating and isotopic analysis. So when we try, and we have, for example, we have one specimen 2,000 years ago. We won't. We will try to restore it and to put it in its original shape. But when we do that, we damage other information that is hidden in the bones. So it's a dilemma where what to do with what we found, with what we find. One option is just to keep some of the material separately and not treat it with glue and not to try to reconstruct it, just to leave it apart. The problem that you skip material for your morphological research and other studies. So it's also always a debate what is more important, what we should do, and how to treat the bones that we receive. I think so if you have any questions. So
perfect. Thank you so much. So please join us. Don't sit on the side. So I guess what we'll do, since this session is running out of time, so I think we'll just move smoothly as the conversation develops from what we planned to do originally, which was like a broader conclusion of the workshop. I think we could take as our point of departure a lot of the discussion, because I think there are many points that came out in the past 2 days which now resurfaced in the discussions. I know that at some point tomorrow you'll have to depart, but we're going to continue until almost 6, and you're definitely welcome to stay here with us for the rest of the discussion. So, Andy, would you like to go first?
Well, what I had planned to do was
different,
some very general questions for everyone, but maybe we can take off from these presentations a little bit.
Okay.
Let me. I was thinking through the various talks we've seen over the last 2 days, and I thought it would be useful just to kind of provoke our memories a bit, to list quickly some of the key objects that have come up and are sites of preservation. So, or subjects of biopreservation. So, red lists, Taiwanese bird watchers, posthumously captured sperm, frozen tissue samples, the movable beehive, endangered fish, spacecraft, peregrine falcon fledglings, and dioramas of mammals. What do these objects either have or not have in common with each other? I think in juxtaposition with one another, we might ask what interesting new kinds of questions emerge. And I wanted to just lay out a few of the questions that have already been posed, and I think, in fact, these are all very relevant for the presentation on the museum. How do we select what living things, what bio objects to preserve, and why do we preserve them? Is it a knowledge project? Is there some value or potential for the future that we see in them? Do we have some sense of responsibility to the past that makes us want to carry them forward into the future? In what sense can biopreservation projects be seen as a form of mourning, a memorialization? How does biopreservation relate to and differ from cultural preservation? So that obviously just came up. And how does the concept of preservation differ from other related concepts like conservation and restoration? So those are just some questions that I was provoked by over the last couple of days. I want to throw them out there, but open up the conversation to others to make some associations, and sort of let us know what themes really stuck out for you, and what questions will linger for you.
I think that's great, and I just want to add another one, which I think also came up very clearly from this discussion of the museum, which is how flexible this notion. I mean, just first beginning with the museum, right? So this has come up very, very clearly. I mean, this is not what I had expected. I met Tamar to discuss the museum, and I thought, okay, I've been to natural history museums. I know what to expect. The stuffed animals. Then it turned out to be something completely different, very present, and I think this is something that has come up in many of the papers. This transformation of the idea of preservation and different techniques and different ways of doing these things. So I think that's another parallel to open to add to, I think, Andy's essential list.
The red list.
The red list. So I guess the discussion is open. Don't feel. Yeah, please go ahead.
A lay question, I suppose. So how is this different than a catalog or an archive, like you said? Why is it a museum? I mean, or is it that in any museum that I go to, there's this back scene of research that I don't know about, and this zone is.
In all natural history museums, they're all research institutions. Not all of them are open to the public, but all of them have natural history collections and do research. So it's a thing about natural history museums as opposed to science museums, for example. I want to answer one thing that Andy said, and then I'll go for money at that building. There's a big question now. I finished writing a book chapter for Yael book on replication now, and so I read up some of the literature, and there's a big controversy now. Traditionally, natural history museums did support taxonomy, biogeography, and evolutionary research. And the culture of what to keep and not to keep was according to that culture. Now there's a strong pressure by conservation biologists to keep good time series for localities or for species and so on, which requires really a different culture and sort of puts the taxonomist in a position of rather than the scientists, but the people who give the support or the service to the real scientists, the ecologists, and so on. And so there is somewhat of a culture clash there. And this thing needs to be resolved because the answer is probably somewhere in the middle. It's not, there ought to be a middle ground there. And we are not sure in a lot of things. We throw away a lot of things that we collect because we don't have the room to keep our way throwing out the right things or the wrong things. What type of record do we need to keep that would be valuable for the future and so on. So this is something that museums are really grappling with now. And so I'm going to go and grapple elsewhere. It's a very much.
Thank you again, Tamar.
Just to follow up on that, I have the feeling that the question of loss from the perspective of museums takes double meaning, because museums allow to identify loss outside the museums. Precisely, if you identify species that are extinct, you still have a specimen that is stuffed in a museum, and it creates a possibility of mourning by kind of cult of the dead object. But then there's also the question of loss within the museums. That is, all the lost objects, the dichotomies or the discrepancies between the inventories and the actual objects. So all the questions that curators...
The decaying objects.
The decaying objects. And I just want to mention that there was, maybe you know about that, there was a conference at Brown University in May on the lost museums.
On the lost museum?
On the lost museums, which was precisely about the end of a collection's life cycle, the way museum objects break down, how collections fall into disuse. So it's interesting to take loss in these two meanings.
I would just follow. I was thinking that when Tamar was talking, there is something actually very remarkable about the creation of a new natural history museum at a time when maybe you saw this article in Nature earlier this spring about museum collections as the endangered dead, that they are there, but they're jeopardized. So everything, it's already dead, but it's endangered, like twice dead, or like endangered again. And at my institution, at Yale, which is the Peabody Museum for Natural History, there's a lot of anxiety, and one of the people cited in that article is the collections manager there, that there aren't enough people to do the work of maintaining the collections for these manifold, flexible, mutable possibilities, which is, I guess, another point that really came through to me in talking and everything, is that holding that loss and preservation aren't antagonistic. They're not like opposite poles together, but the act of preserving something is always a choice of loss. It always involves some kind of loss, but it also can be a form of possibility, because it's something that's found, can be found again and again and again in all of these different ways that you all showcase. So there's something about this sort of mutability and possibility that makes these both the collections like endangered dead but more alive than we might be willing to admit. So.
Sure.
Just to continue a little comment, I think that from my little understanding, I think this was the kind of the endangered kind of museum, the collection, that type of atmosphere was existent here for many years, and it still is. I mean, Tel Aviv, the museum here is kind of a story of success, but from what I know, say the Hebrew University, the sense there is very similar to what you were describing. And also very small, I don't know if to call it a natural history museum, but especially museums of display that exist in various places throughout the country, especially in kibbutzim, they all are exactly that, and they're now all brought together to this big, to the collections here. So it's not like just one type of story. It's all.
Can I just say one other thing that was a theme that I noticed when I was reading the papers, and I think really came out, is this tension between the individual and the collective, both at the level of like a species and an individual, but these sort of constitution aggregations of collectives. And I was interested that you used the word assemblages in your description of these things, because I think that sort of nicely I don't know if it was intentional, but like captures that these are not just their assemblage, their collections of, or accumulations of individuals into like these into these assemblages. So that tension seems that's brought out by the kind of not just the level of individual organisms, but even at the level of collections or assemblages themselves.
Can I ask a question whether, as a layman who doesn't know much about such collections, don't you ever get the feeling of being overwhelmed by the sheer quantity of the archival material? I'm reminded of Nietzsche's, the philosopher Nietzsche, who wrote a fascinating essay on how can history harm or benefit human beings. And he has that, he calls it archival history. Archival history is just ongoing collection of everything, you know? And then, even with the sophisticated taxonomy and computer ways of accessing it, it seems that these millions of items, I mean, how can we make sense of it?
It's a library. It's really a library on which people come to research. Not everything goes in.
Even libraries throw
yeah,
books.
So that's my next
sentence. Museums of paintings throw out.
That's my next sentence. That not everything that comes to the museum really goes into the collection. Sometimes the curators say, "Oh, I had enough sparrows. You can spare that one." And it
maybe trade it with some other museum.
If we had another museum in the country, it would be nice, but we don't. And so there is selection of what goes in, and what goes in is things that can contribute to more knowledge. I want to say something about the what you described about the situation of natural history museums. Tamar referred to it a little bit when she talked about the molecular revolution and since the 60s, 70s, where most funds in life sciences went into the molecular level. And that's what the stage where museums, which are part of museums in general, which are part of cultural institutions in general, which are really in always on a struggle, everywhere, almost everywhere, except Yad Vashem maybe. But so, and David can say about the Smithsonian.
Yeah, Tamar summarized it pretty well. It's an archive of life. And without vouchers, you can't repeat science. So that's an important distinction. And your theme is loss. There's lots of different losses as you were applying. It's interesting that there was a symposium on this in Brown because, for example, Brown's insect collection is now at Yale, Peabody Museum. There's loss like that. There's lots of orphaned collections. Use that word. And we get at the Smithsonian requests all the time for collections. And as Yael said, we scrutinize that. Some departments more than others. We have a committee, a collections committee, which evaluates whether it is worth scientifically keeping it in many different ways, whether we have the space, whether we have the personnel, which is a big issue lately because, as Tamar also implied, personnel are being reduced. In the Natural History Museum in the Smithsonian, we've lost about 40% of the collections staff in the last 20 years. So it's pretty serious. And we've had to deactivate some parts of the collection, which doesn't mean giving them away. We still preserve them for the reasons we've been discussing, but we've had to limit access to the scientific community because we just can't process it. So, and another aspect of loss, which happens inside the museum, is a conservation loss. And I don't mean conservation like you've been talking about, I mean conserving materials. There's a whole science behind that now. I don't believe yet that Steinhardt has a conservator, but Smithsonian Natural History just got one a few years ago. So it's an aspect of museums that's really important to preserve them and preserve them in the proper way, whether it's the glue interacting with the bones or the DNA. All this stuff is a part of the modern science of museum.
So I was interested because this is also a topic that came up in our discussions about the question of affect. What is the and what kind of passions do people bring into this kind of preservation or museum creation? And so there's one. The one is that of the librarian, which which is the real. I mean, the librarians often seem like dispassionate, but that's a real passion for collecting these things. And I think Tamar said, with respect to ecosystems, everything is important, right? It all counts. It all counts. So it's true. I mean, there are limits to what you can do, but this notion, this kind of passion that of the collector. Then there's a different kind of more instrumental, and that also comes out a lot in the discussion, also of this museum, I think. But you'll correct me. It's relevant. I mean, and you can go to the ministry, any one of them, and say, this museum will help us in A, B, C. Will help us in protecting the environment. It will help us in understanding the history. There's something that didn't come up in the discussion, which is and this goes back actually to Ritz's original question, which is, okay, so this just seems like a big archive. Where's the museum? And I think what it was implied in part in this is, where's the public? I mean, the museum is not just for the researchers and for the affect of the researchers in collecting this and making this available, but there's always this play, which we've also seen in our discussions. I'm thinking of Etienne's paper, but more generally of the public and the effect that the museum will create for that public. So maybe you could. Yeah, so maybe you could say a little bit about that also.
Okay, so I'm heading a project which is called Nature Campus. Was established at 2000 by the director of the university, and it really encompasses the all public activities, the outreach of the zoological garden, zoological research garden, botanical garden, and then it was the natural history collections. Nature Campus was supposed to be the precursor for the public space of the museum, and we are already operating for 15 years. What we do is communication of science to the public. That's how we define ourselves. If someone asked me what is my profession, I said translator, because I'm translating scientific language, either it's in English, Hebrew, it doesn't matter, to layman language. We try to do most activities that natural history museums or biodiversity research centers do all over the world, which means public programs from kindergarten children up to decision makers. We work the whole spectrum of audience.
But what do you show them? So I understand you go to the the zoological garden or the botanical garden. You can see beautiful flowers or beautiful animals. That I understand. But you bring them to the collections.
Yes.
So
when, what do we see there?
Okay. So when
where's the freezer? What do you see in the freezer?
No,
how do you light the freezer?
Right.
we take some specimen and we work on them as you work on any object in the museum. In fact, all our pedagogy in everything that we do is museological. Either it doesn't matter if the animal is alive or dead. It's the same for me if I see a fallow deer in the zoological garden or I see it stuffed. It serves as an object of inquiry. And it depends on the topic that we are dealing. If I'm talking about nature conservation, it will be one story. If I'm talking about evolution, it will be a different story. If I'm talking about the fauna of Israel, it will be different. If I'm talking about reproduction, I'm talking about deer. It's a wonderful animal to speak about reproduction. So I'm talking about something else. So in every theme that I'm trying to convey and to educate about, I'm using this object as a substance, as a concrete object of concrete object to put a scientific inquiry. And we hope that now when we'll have in a year we'll have exhibition halls, all our opportunities, educational opportunities, will be totally different. Not only the exhibition halls, but also lecture halls, which is. as important.
I've seen signs all over the university with birds.
That's us.
Okay, so that's also part
Wait,
of
what
the
are the
outreach
signs?
program.
Yeah, that's an outreach program. In fact, this program was initiated by engineering students who came to us with this wonderful idea, and of course we.
What's the idea?
You haven't seen it.
I'm
There
sure
are
I have seen it, but-
signs of common birds on campus, and you see
To identify the birds.
Oh, you can
to
identify.
identify the birds. You have it here near the palm or date garden, and you
Yeah,
see it
that's
near
enough,
and gate 2.
There's several.
Yeah, many
Okay.
locations.
And
So I was struck by the name for the new museum, the subtitle, the Center for the Study of Biodiversity, and I wanted to reflect on whether that is a novel task for natural history museums, and that to me directly related to the theme of loss, and that you know, my own experience, sometimes I think it's explicit and sometimes implicit of going to natural history museums is actually something of a feeling of loss and precarity, and that seems possibly quite distinct from the, let's call it an earlier golden age of the founding of natural history museums, in which there was certainly a didactic purpose of teaching the public and also a purpose of conveying the wonder of the natural world, but probably less of a sense of the fragility of the natural world than one gets today at natural history museums. So I think that I wanted to hear about that dimension of kind of public affect, teaching people that we're in trouble, that loss is at hand.
That's true that the natural history museums and also zoos and botanical gardens and aquariums, they embrace nature conservation goals, and they see themselves as spearheading education and also maybe before that, research, action and education on those three. If you look at, like, I don't know, the Bronx Zoo made a decade ago an exhibition about gorillas. It's not what we expect to see. It's really a nature conservation exhibition where the gorillas are the presenters.
The indicators.
Yeah,
the
but they're just, they're just. So you see it all over. In fact, you know, the term of biodiversity was invented in 1986 in order to brand anew the nature and to see it as a whole, and not only to look at flag species like gorillas or rhinos or elephants, but to look at all species, like Tamar showed, that most of them are tiny.
Eli, did you want to add in? Then
well, I must emphasize that I'm talking from the anthropological point of view and not from the really huge diversity and of animals, the animal world. And I don't think it's a loss. And it's a way to educate the public about the importance of our ancestors, because the way that we got today to the modern population with all its advantages and disadvantages is because what happened, let's say the transition point was 15,000 years ago, and if they wouldn't know what happened then, they wouldn't understand why it's happening now. And by understanding that, we can also go ahead and invent new things. So we don't lose anything by that. We just add information, and this is our job as scientists, is to give more information and more knowledge to the public.
Okay, Etienne?
I'm not sure where this fits into the discussion, but there's something about the image of the cheetah that Tamar showed that stuck with me, and it also made me think about this question of the temporality of the Natural History Museum in a couple ways, both the sense that I had, that I expressed last night of the Natural History Museum as a 19th century institution, but also the question of what kinds of temporalities actually get instantiated in different parts of the museum at different times. So let me try to make sense of this. So what was interesting to me about the cheetah, I was thinking, what did the cheetah mean when it was collected, and what does it mean now, right? And maybe one of the it meant a lot of things when it was collected. It meant like I'm a great hunter and I killed a cheetah, and then but in terms of like a natural history collection that was oriented towards the classification of the diversity of life, you can imagine it as, what is its relationship to time? Well, maybe there's some sense of evolutionary time post-Darwin. Maybe not necessarily, right? You can also imagine collections of natural diversity that aren't linked to that sense of evolutionary time, but instead of a static model of nature. But let's just say that it was linked to some sense of evolutionary time. Well, what does the cheetah mean now? It continues to do that, right? It continues to be part of an evolutionary history. But it's also a cheetah from 1900, right, at that particular moment. And so are all the other collections. That we can now understand them not as a map, not as a Foucauldian grid over the diversity of life, right, spread out in some kind of single moment, like a table, but we can understand it as having depth and layers, and go back and dig through that archive as a historical archive to say what were cheetahs eating in 1900 versus what are cheetahs eating today, or what was the genetic characteristics of a cheetah in 1900 versus today. And that seems to me like something that you can see changing as the Natural History Museum itself ages over time, that it can become also a historic, even the nature side of the museum, right? Not the archaeological side. Even the nature side of the museum can start to become historical. And it seems to me that one of the things that we've been talking about in the past couple of days has been the kind of rearrangement of temporalities in institutions and across different spaces. So the way that a national park versus a zoo versus a museum versus a laboratory versus a frozen zoo, all of these different things have potentially different relationships to the past, and themselves are also evolving in time. That's a very vague general statement, but I'm trying to pull out things that I can generalize from across the conference.
This pretty much follows up on what Etienne just said, but it was a remark and a question about the universality of museums, because I understand that the anthropological collections come from Israel, and with its long temporality.
From where?
From the region.
So the anthropological collections come from Israel, but I was wondering if the natural or the botanical and zoological collection also came from Israel, because as Andy said, the 19th century museums were based on the idea of bringing the wonders of the world in capital cities that had this pretension of universality. And now maybe with what we discussed about this feeling of biodiversity, we don't need to have that. There's another sense of universality that can be produced only by showing the vulnerability of the collections within one country.
We concentrate on the region. It's not only Israel, but because it's the Mediterranean and the Red Sea and
it's the big Israel.
It's mainly mainly from Israel. Yeah, I think about 80 to 90% of it.
So Tamar, yeah.
I don't know if this is not at all a question. It's just a story I know about this particular specimen I started researching, and it answers some of the questions that Etienne and Frederic were raising. So I just I'm just gonna go ahead and tell it just because it's kind of interesting. So it's about an ostrich, and it the Syrian ostrich that has gone extinct. But the story begins with this, perhaps the first person who systematically started collecting, or I think it's the first Jewish one who started systematically collecting here, zoologist Israel Awani, whose collections are now at the Hebrew University. And he was interested, I mean, as you were saying, to bringing the world to museum. In Europe, he was mainly initially collecting as a way, I mean, he got money from European museums, and he would just send them stuff from here because they didn't have enough stuff of Asia Minor. So there were a bunch of stuff they didn't have, and so the ostrich became this desired animal because it ran so fast and there weren't so many of it left, so he went on and caught it close to Damascus. And he cared about it for other reasons, because he was sure it was what was called the namit. It's a bird that is described in the book of Job. So, and he had this whole process of finding Hebrew terminology for nature. Basically, he went on pretty systematically and was kind of the Linnaeus, the local Linnaeus, only in Hebrew. And so he caught that bird, and then so for the questions of display, it was initially displayed to the Jewish public in one of the settlements, and then didn't survive very long, and very quickly it died and made it to what is now the Hebrew University collections, and it's still there. So what has happened to his collection during the years is that along the years, the whole, the idea of the collections really declined, and it ended up in some shack, and no one really took care of it, and the ostrich itself really lost most of its hair, so talking about loss. And then the whole collection was coupled with not manuscript, but all his books and all his notes. So only recently they managed to find some funds to kind of recover this collection, and now it's sitting there in a new room. But his entire archive is gone. So the archive of nature survives, but the archive is lost. And now they have some. So they're thinking to, it's their way to promote, kind of reestablish the importance of the collection is to kind of have a room of display and display some of Aloni's animals. And they're still trying to figure out how to design that to, as you use the word educate a lot, so how to educate people about the importance of this and its historical history. But in the meantime, they have like a little shelf that there's a student who gets some money like once a week to preserve. They have some bottles of, I don't know, materials that they try to make it look prettier because it's pretty much bold. Okay, so
I think it may be a fable about life.
So that's it, that's all.
Okay, well, unfortunately, this seems like the discussion is only starting, but our time is basically over. So first of all, let me thank our panelists for this last session, and also the rest of the participants and the audience and everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.